Oh, welcome everybody. I think one thing Warwick forgot to say yesterday was that, as farmers we buy retail, sell wholesale and pay the freight both ways. So,
Just come a bit closer to the mic.
okay. Well, I farm 280 hectares pretty close to the lake, all heavy clay soils. As you can see, 170 of Waterton shallow, 60 of Temuka clay and 50 of Wakanui and Templeton silt, which I'm not quite sure what to do with because I've always farmed clay soils, and these so-called elite silt soils are sort of weird and strange things. I was a pretty wayward child and pretty useless when I left school. I couldn't really read. Had a reading age of about 10, and so I sort of bundled myself off over to seas and travelled a bit and sort of sorted myself out, and discovered that actually really what I did want to do eventually was go farming. And Dad was an interesting character. Mum was very stoic and she was very capable, and she got things done, and Dad was quite histrionic, and so they were sort of perfect together. But so it was an interesting upbringing and an interesting farming situation. So predominantly what we're doing is what I consider we're doing is conservation agriculture, which is essentially residue retention. So we don't burn or bale or get rid of any straw. We just flick it out the back of the header and leave it. We use no-till. I'm an experimental farmer. I'm never really been a slave to the dollar. I mean, people get up and start talking about how much money they earn, and I get sort of pretty bored and start going to sleep and say, well, what are you actually doing with your life? And I don't mean mean to be offensive to anybody who is interested in those things, because they're probably passionate about that as well. So life is short. I've probably got 60 years of farming in me, and I'm about halfway through. So I've just got to get on and get it done. I can't wait to be told what to do by the government or the regional council or anyone else. So just a brief overview. Crops include Phacelia, peas, linseed, wheat, ryegrass, as you can see, fescue. Just recently we've started growing companion crops, and that's sort of oats, tares, crimson clover in various combinations, experimenting with multi-crop, in-crop, hybrid radish, mustard, and other crops include kale, hemp, barley, and I think there's some. There's a chap I was talking to yesterday about miscanthus, which is actually one I hadn't thought of, but apparently you can sell that to the Christchurch Hospital for fuel. So I guess it's one way maybe intensive farms, including dairy farms with spare corners and things, might be able to incorporate a bit of sale of carbon. But I think generally because soil carbon isn't involved in the ETS, there's not terribly many opportunities for those of us who have incredibly expensive land and not really any waste or so-called waste areas or country that's suitable for forestry per se. So I came home, we'll start at the beginning I suppose, and in the mid-70s our Waterton clays were getting pretty hard to cultivate. We got to a point where all our gear was worn out, and Dad sort of thought, well, we either have to buy a bigger tractor and a rotary hoe and just beat it that much harder to get it to do what we want it to do, or we could try doing something different. So there was a contractor with a direct drill, and Roundup had just come on the market, so we just basically jumped in, boots and all, into that, and about that time everybody raced in and gave no-till a go, and then about 2 years later they all raced back out again because there were all the challenges that really made it not that good at the start. Just substituting one system for the other was pretty much a complete failure. So we persevered anyway through the 80s. My father had a reasonable sized sheep and beef property down on the shores of Lake Ellesmere, so I guess that probably subsidised the cropping farm through that period when basically Roger Douglas decided that farming was a sunset industry, and I left school in 83 and started work in 84, and learnt pretty quickly that you don't trust politicians after that election. So I'm fairly cynical, having started my farming career at a time when everybody was sort of really struggling to keep their heads above water. So I travelled overseas in the late 80s, went to Lincoln, and then came home in 1991 and thought, well, yeah, this is great, what am I going to do? And I looked at organic farming and I thought, well, we can't cultivate our country, and we'd already made 15 years worth of progress. So, and the soils were starting to build organic matter, albeit very slowly. So I thought, well, I'm going to be a conservation agriculture farmer, whatever that means. And so basically at that point we stopped doing it, because we were still burning and baling and all that sort of thing. We started keeping all our harvest residues and growing cover crops, simple single species, essentially winter green feed crops, and then that really started to get the whole system humming. We were still basically doing, we're still using plenty of chemical and plenty of fertiliser, and getting good results. And that built and built and built until I sort of got to 2016, and I purchased a neighbouring farm off a horse farmer, and I thought, well, it's probably a good time to look for a new direction in life. Well, actually, first of all, I tried to sell part of the farm because I thought, well, we'll just downsize. I'm getting sick of spraying. I'm getting sick of all this stuff. Nothing's really changing. We're doing well. We can downsize and, invest in something else. And then the block next door came up. I couldn't sell mine, so land prices were slipping, so I bought that one instead. So sort of out of the frying pan and into the fire. But wisely at the same time, I decided to experimentally go into biological agriculture. So, if you're going to jump into the fire, you might as well jump in completely. Which didn't mean I was going to stop doing everything else I was doing. It just meant I was going to start looking at better ways of doing things, because I don't believe there's any future in what we're doing at the moment in the arable industry. It's just, this precision agriculture bandwagon where you can do everything so precisely, but you're actually just essentially doing the same thing. Einstein said if you keep trying to do the same thing over and over and expecting a different outcome, well, that basically, that's insanity. So just a good example of, I've got a next door neighbour, and this is just over the fence. And this neighbour's moved on subsequently, but you can see the talcum powder job, beautiful fine firm seed bed, free of weeds, and promptly jumping over the fence when we get a gust of wind. And this is sort of what we ended up with on the foliage on our side of the fence. So we're mulching stubbles. We've got at least one set of oyster catchers nesting in pretty much every paddock on the farm. We've got skylarks, we've got all the birds you could believe, including the ones that annoy the hell out of us from time to time, but everybody's got to be fed. And you can see there's some interesting things you can now do with cover crops, which I'll go into in more detail. But this is just an outline of where I got to and how I got to where I am. So at that 2016 time, I got a lot of sort of comprehensive soil testing done at one of the universities in Australia. What do we got in our soils? And thought, well, we don't need to put any more fertiliser on for about the next maybe 150 to 250 years. And we wanted to detoxify the system. The point of this is that we're trying to build carbon in soil, and all those inputs, what the latest science from all over the world, except for New Zealand, where we don't do any science in this area, is showing is that by detoxifying and developing plant relationships and working on soil structure and plant diversity, you can build soil very, very quickly. You can build carbon in soil very, very quickly, and actually the greatest potential for sequestering carbon is in those productive topsoils. It's just a matter of learning out how to do it and developing the systems to do so. So as I said, decided to get off the high-tech gravy train because it doesn't really interest me. I enjoy, one of the things I enjoy about farming is actually working on the farm. I actually enjoy. I go around the farm, I dig holes, I look at my soil. I love that. That's what farming is to me. So the other thing that sort of pushed us in that direction was the fact that after all these years of retaining residue, we'd built 4 to 6% organic matter in soil, which when you calculate the tonnage is a lot. I couldn't give you the figures, but I have seen them, and I just can't remember, because knowing the number of tonnes of carbon that I've stored isn't of any value to me, because I can't do anything with that. But it was disappointing that the rooting zone and everything else seemed to be getting shallower. I mean, we're monoculture, short rotation crops, intensive. We're not cultivating, but so what's going on. So I'm going to drag you on a bit of a journey here that's really got nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but you're stuck in the room and we've locked the door so you can't get out. So how did we get here? So one of my wayward things is to always challenge absolutely everything anybody ever says to me in terms of presenting something as a fact, and especially a scientific fact, because when you understand science, you understand that people do randomised replicated trials, and then they come up with a set of results, and then they form an opinion about what is going on here. So they'll say, what the evidence is showing me is this. So there's an opinion in there, okay? So everything so it can be questioned. You can go back to the source material, you can look at the work, and you say, well, I'm going to reinterpret that in a different way. And because I'm not a scientist, well, I have no credibility. But that doesn't worry me, because it's just my interest. So I'm interested in evolutionary biology and ecology. So here we have, and just to illustrate a few points, basically nothing is static, everything is in a state of perpetual change. And we can see this through the lifetime of the planet from 4.6 billion years ago to now. Goodness knows how they know this, but it'll be from the fossil record and the older ones. But predominantly it wasn't a very nice place to live until about, first life started about 4 billion years ago with organisms that had no cell membrane, but they could synthesize, well, they're basically methane oxidizers, so they could use methane as an energy source. About 3.5, and they started to change the components in the atmosphere as a result of that chemosynthesis. So then about 3.5 billion years ago, in here, you had the beginning of photosynthesis. So you had the first cyanobacteria came along. So they could take light and they could produce carbohydrates. So they were starting to store carbon and remove it from the atmosphere. And they also released oxygen, which started to oxidize all the oxidizable metals in the sea, and all the iron got oxidized out, and you have all those huge iron deposits in Western Australia and all over the world, and stromatolites and what have you. But after everything else was oxidized, it released a huge amount of oxygen into the atmosphere, and that caused climate change, massive climate change. And this is a great thing called the Great Oxygenation Event that happened 2.4 billion years ago, that basically threw the planet that had been warm before that into a global ice age. So there was ice just about covering the whole planet. And that lasted for a while, as you can imagine, and then I think they hypothesised that there were a few volcanic events which put a bit more greenhouse gas into the atmosphere and started warming the place up again. The other thing that oxygen reacted with was methane in the atmosphere once it got to a certain level. The other interesting thing that happened is organisms' cells started to evolve with a membrane, because before that they didn't need a membrane, because the guts of the cell didn't oxidize because there was no oxygen. But as soon as there was oxygen, the cell got destroyed by oxygen, so it needed a membrane. So that's another interesting thing. Now, all of these organisms still exist today, and they live in agricultural soils, and this is why they're important. So about 850 million years ago, terrestrial plants started to appear, and then so on. Now these organisms that started at the very beginning of life on Earth were methanogens. So they generated, methanotrophs. They ate methane essentially, and then so there are both those organisms and the organisms that produce methane that live in our soils. So life begins on Earth. Very first organism, beautiful thing, a lichen. So that is and this is an important point for soil carbon. All life is a symbiosis. So no life, a human being isn't a human being. A human being is 98% bacteria, DNA-wise, 2% human DNA. So we are just big bacterial taxis. And if you killed all our bacteria, we'd drop dead. Apart from that, we'd probably be a small quivering lump on the floor or something. So we cannot survive without our symbionts. They feed us, they protect us. So therefore, that leads on to symbiosis leads to more and more complex life, which leads to more and more symbiosis, which leads to building soil, more complex organisms. You got your lichens. This is in my old dairy yard at home. So you've got the lichens, then you've got your mosses, and then you've got your grasses once a bit more soil's been formed, and then there's a tree at the back you can't really see. So you can actually assess the health of an agricultural system by the plants that grow there. Why is this relevant, you may say? Well, we're talking about growing carbon in soil. Well, I'm talking about growing carbon in soil. So, as you can see, soil isn't soil. Soil is a living organism, and this is just the basic food web that lives in the soil, and that's the relative quantities of the different types of organisms, from the microscopic to the flying. And so this is the soil that I purchased on the horse farm, and we can see here this is a Temuka clay loam. It's about 4 metres deep. It's clay on clay, so it's pretty much the same material all the way from the surface to the water table. And here's our lovely ryegrass white clover. This was just after I took the property over. Ryegrass white clover pasture that's going to, AgResearch reckons it's going to be the saviour of New Zealand agriculture. They've genetically modified this thing that it's going to be so wonderful. And its roots only go down that far. At some stage in the past, this soil has had a deeper rooting system in it, and you can see there's still carbon left in that soil. And then we've got the band with a high water table. You've got where the iron oxide has come up in the soil, and then underneath it's totally anaerobic. So all the same material, all potential for growing carbon. We can put carbon anywhere in there. But how do we do it? Well, about 410 million years ago, when those first plants were sort of starting to get going on land, generally they didn't have root systems, and they had these fungal partners which helped that they were their roots. And that was a plant called algophyton, which is quite an interesting looking thing that didn't actually live for very long. But we have two main forms of symbiosis, and there's what we call endomycorrhizal fungi, which form with most agricultural plants, and so these fungi, when the plant germinates and the root sticks out, hormones in the plant puts in the soil, the spores nearby, the spore germinates and grows through the root, inside the root, and up inside the cell. Oops, what have I done? Up inside the cell, inside the root. So it can enlarge the root system of a plant by up to 100 times. Trees and your pine forests and all the rest of it have ectomycorrhizal fungi, which do the same thing, but they live in the cell. They live in the space between the cells. They don't actually go inside the cells themselves. The other thing that plants do is exude. Hang on, just bear with me a sec. No, that's all good. First things first. To grow carbon in soil, you need the basic physical properties of soil right. So you look at your calcium-magnesium ratios. Calcium is always the most deficient thing in most agricultural soils. And you want a sort of a 5 to 1 in silt and a 7 to 1 ratio of calcium to magnesium. And that allows the soil to be properly flocculated and aerated so that all those aerobic processes of life in the soil, which will build carbon, can occur. One of the signs of a healthy system is rhizosheath development, where you get, it's been described as Rastafarian roots, or you get these, and all that is the plant, even from the very seedling stage, is exuding simple carbohydrates from the roots to feed the organisms around the roots, so that the organisms can mobilize minerals from the soil and feed the plant. So the organisms that live in the soil get carbohydrates, the plant gets nutrients. You won't see this in a heavily fertilized soil. You won't see this in a heavily chemically treated soil. And I've got a whole raft of photos to prove that, but I am not a scientist, so I don't actually have to prove anything to anybody other than to myself. So I've actually done this, I know it works, and I've observed it, and I'm recording it all the time. So carbon farming, how? So really it doesn't require a lot, actually. Just an open mind, read a bit, and don't believe most of what you hear coming out of Ravensdown, Balance, Lincoln, Massey, soil science departments, because they're all obsessed with the fact that none of this is true. But just about every university everywhere else in the world that has a soil science department is just accepting that this is a fact, and they're doing really good work on looking at how this works, how it can be enhanced. So, multi-species cover crops. So really, you want diversity is the key. You want it's based on the premise that soil is a living thing, that soil organisms feed plants, plants feed soil organisms. The greater the diversity of those organisms, the more effective the system. So I use, for example, after harvest, which I haven't got on this particular slide, we mulch stubble, and after our wheat early, we sort of mid-February, we'll plant a mixture of oats, rye, lupin, faba beans, buckwheat, ryegrass, phacelia, berseem clover, crimson clover, and sunflower. And that's going to overwinter. The berseem clover, the sunflower, and the buckwheat will pretty much disappear after the first frost. But what we're looking for is root architecture. We want to punch some holes down in that soil. We want to drag some simple carbohydrates from the photosynthetic process down into the soil to create a massive life in the soil biome, deep in the soil. If you can get that active biome, those things live and die, and they deposit their carbon deep in the soil. The decay cycle is a very slow way of sequestering carbon, and that is what all the calculations based around soil carbon in New Zealand are premised on. They do not accept the liquid carbon pathway that we're talking about here. The other things I'm playing, so that's that 10 species cover crop. That photo was taken a couple of weeks ago. So that's just being grazed by lambs at the moment, and they're absolutely loving it. They go into the break, they eat for an hour and a half, and they sit down. And if you've got animals sitting down, that tells you that they're getting something out of their feed that makes them feel satiated. They're not looking as though they're about to float off into space, because they're balloons that are so full of food because they've got nothing that regulates their appetite. So these multi-species cover crops with the different root architecture, you can see there's a lupin, and lupin is an interesting creature because it's a non-mycorrhizal legume. So, and there's phacelia, which is a highly mycorrhizal forb. And both different, you could see there's a very, very different, that produces a massive fine roots, and that just heads south, well, north probably, but and it's going to punch holes and drag that, because roots will grow where roots have been, and the point is to build that living layer of soil. So briefly, other things that we're experimenting with at the moment is, so I build my own machinery because I can well, I'm a fussy bugger and I'm never satisfied, so I can never find anything that works for what I want to do. So this is the new drill I built last year, 6 metre one. But we're sowing here, we've planted, this autumn, I've planted Phacelia, buckwheat and crimson clover immediately after the peas were harvested. And because I don't want to have to do another weed control and we're looking at taking the chemical out of the system, I sort of thought, well, that could grow up, produce a cover crop, and then we can plant the wheat in, because you can't plant the wheat, you know, in March. So the other day I've planted the wheat into row. So there's a bit of high-tech gear I do use with GPS, just run up between the rows, and there's the wheat coming up in between the rows, and the wheat was planted about 4 weeks ago, and it's about this high now. And so you're getting a synergistic effect of having those two plants growing together, or that group of plants going together. What I haven't told you is over 2/3 of the paddock, the slugs ate all the crimson clover, half of the buckwheat and about 1/3 of the Phacelia, so it's patchy, but the wheat's all come up. Another one we do is oats, tares and crimson clover, so tares are vetch, and there's quite a good market there for us for selling seed for this, and it's actually interesting. This paddock, this crop, produced about 4 tonnes to the hectare of spray-free milling oats. It produced about 1 tonne of crimson clover and about, we produced about 25 tonnes in total. Of that, half and half was oats and half was vetch. But it's actually the best return on the farm because I put no fertiliser on it, put no chemical on it, and we sold the seed for really high value because the oats were selling for $1,200 a tonne because they're spray-free oats. So I'd rather grow 3-4 tonne of spray-free oats and get $1,000 a tonne for them than grow 8 tonnes at $300 a tonne or whatever they're getting. So, but that was just an experiment, you know, small area. Is it scalable? Don't know, but I'm going to try again. Another one's growing Phacelia with milling wheat and Phacelia and crimson clover with milling wheat. One of the criteria here is not interfering with harvest operations, not contaminating what we're trying to produce. So you've got to look for crops that are compatible at harvest time and not contaminate. Friend of mine, Hamish Bielski, down in North Otago, he wanted to establish a multi-species pasture. There's probably about 30 species in the pasture. Plus he chucked in some Conquest milling wheat with it. He harvested about 3 tonne to the hectare of milling wheat and then had feed, you know, they just had to skim the top, but he had feed like this afterwards in a dry autumn when all his neighbours had no feed. So didn't earn much off it in terms of the grain, but it pretty much paid for the establishment, and then he had a massive amount of feed going into the autumn. Very early days for pasture crop in New Zealand. That's the first time it's been done that I'm aware of, and you know, watch the space for the hill country guys, but they'll probably want to go and plant trees. So seed bed preparation here, going in here in the spring. I've got a multi-species cover crop, spray it off. In this particular case, I mulched it and then planted. And you can see the results through the season there. There's peas that have been planted into there this last spring. And there's some tractor porn for those of you who like it. 45-year-old John Deere. It's a cool thing to drive. And that's the primary cultivation equipment there doing the job immediately after harvest before the multi-species cover crop. These are the ice ages at various times. This was an interesting one. There were several sort of global ice ages during here and just before this started actually, but anyway. So you've got your CO2 levels, the orange curve, and then you've got global temperature. And as you can see, there's almost absolutely no relationship between the two whatsoever. That's not to say that there's nothing wrong and that we shouldn't do something about the way we're living, because we're living well beyond our means at the moment. This is carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere for the last 450,000 years, and these are actually pretty accurate because they're taken from ice cores But you can see here over the last sort of 100 and so years, it's gone from here to about, I think yesterday it was 417 parts per million, which tells us that changes in gas ratios over a short time indicates that we're having a critical impact somewhere. And all the rubbish floating around in the oceans and all the shit floating around in the sky and the deforestation of the green belt around the equator is, I believe, having the biggest impact on the climate. And this one's kind of interesting. There's a couple of places where they test the atmospheric gases over time at about 40 degrees south and 40 degrees north. This one's Canada, but it's got your carbon dioxide levels, and you can see the seasonality, summer to winter, as you would expect with growth, and the carbon dioxide goes up and down, but it's trending up. But oxygen levels are trending down. Now, there's no danger of us running out of oxygen anytime soon, and these are not to scale. So it just shows that there is a slight drop-off in the amount of oxygen. So the ability of the biological processes of the planet to replace the oxygen are diminished. And there's just some pretty pictures just to finish off with. This one here is kind of interesting because what I didn't know until last year was that that's a vetch plant, right? And there's quite a few legumes and other plants that have a little gland where the node is, where the leaf, new leaf branch goes off, and there's a little gland in there. And when the plant is growing in a biological manner, that exudes nectar when the plant's under attack from insects. And interestingly enough, there's some really cool work, and it's just been published from the States. It's a guy called John Lundgren. These plants can detect through the mycorrhizal network, because all things are connected through the soil, when pests start to enter a paddock. All these plants over the whole paddock will start to exude nectar to attract flying insects that will then predate the insects that are attacking them. So, there's more there than meets the eye. So I'll just leave you with that.